So I come to my interest in housing honestly. I've been at it for a while. I was a housing attorney at Neighborhood Legal Services. I worked in housing court for years, representing hundreds and hundreds of people who are facing eviction, living in poor living conditions. I represented people who were victims of housing discrimination. I served on the board of Housing Opportunities Made Equal, an organization dedicated to stamping out housing discrimination. And I worked with Push Buffalo to create and establish their housing development arm called the Buffalo Neighborhood Stabilization Company. We ran a land bank, we repurposed vacant lots, we secured abandoned buildings, and we created affordable housing units. So this topic's been close to my heart and my brain for a long time. Housing has been an unsolved issue in Buffalo really since our population started to shrink decades ago. I was at the rollout of the Partnership for Public Good annual agenda a few weeks ago, and I was talking to Andrea Houlihan, the director, and we noted that 15 years ago when they did their first rollout, a pro was an abundance of affordable housing. A con was too many vacant and abandoned lots. Well, a lot's changed in the last 15 years. Today, our problem is a lack of safe and affordable housing. For the first time in 70 years, Buffalo's population is growing. That's great news, but it also means our housing shortage is getting more acute. We've heard all the talk in the national media about Buffalo being a hot housing market. It's a great sign in some ways of a resurgent city, but here's a different perspective. Hot housing market means high prices for homeowners, and it keeps renters from transitioning to becoming homeowners. Time magazine had a slightly different twist on a hot housing market, and they found that Buffalo's housing supply was the second worst out of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. So you can look at the hot housing market many different ways. So our home prices have been inflated by low inventory for several years. Entry-level homeowners, they're being squeezed out. A teacher used to be able to comfortably buy a house in University District. Workers on a city salary could buy a house in Kaisertown and South Buffalo. Now those neighborhoods are becoming out of reach for the average home buyer. A lot of people saved their money, did the right thing, fixed their credit, but skyrocketing interest rates and home values are keeping them from becoming homeowners. And even the people who could just afford to buy a new house, it's becoming more and more expensive. But now that we have new problems, not the same problem as 15 years ago, we need to come up with new policy solutions. So what we've never had since we started losing our population and losing our industrial base is a real comprehensive housing plan for Buffalo. We've never had a state-led plan that brings everyone together to look at all the different aspects of the housing challenges. And I want to change that. But before we get into the details, and there's a lot of details, there's one thing for sure. There's no magic wand that's going to fix it all. If we had a magic wand, it would have been fixed a long time ago. So we're not going to be able to fix this overnight. And the solution's got to require a lot of thoughtful, interconnected policy, but it also means we're going to require collaboration between our state and local governments, but also folks like you who are in this room. The plan I'm going to lay out this afternoon features 4 separate proposals that would make meaningful progress to the biggest housing issues facing Buffalo and its surrounding communities. And as a Buffalonian, I'll slip into the parlance of Buffalo. Buffalo means most of Erie County. So when we say Buffalo, we all kind of know what we mean. But I didn't come up with this plan myself. We've spent months doing research, interviewing national experts, local advocates, included many of the folks that were here today. And once again, thanks for taking the time over the last few months to talk to us. And thanks for everyone in my government team, led by Kate Lockhart and Ian Ott. Thanks for the wonderful work you've done to get us together. So everyone in this room has one thing in common. We're here because we're personally invested in the success of Buffalo. And by increasing the number and improving the condition of housing units in Buffalo, we can address the barriers to keeping people housed. And by doing that, we can make Buffalo a better place for everyone. I know a lot of you had read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. Anyone read that book? I know I did. Yeah, very, very, very interesting, influential book. But when I read that book, I felt like the author was living my life as a housing attorney. It's a real good illustration that the impact that eviction has on American families and neighborhoods each and every day. There's a passage in the book that sticks out to me, and it says, when people have a place to live, they become better parents, workers, and citizens. But the opposite's also true. When people don't have stable housing, it creates a cascading harm on the rest of their lives. Employment, education outcomes, health outcomes, all tied to stable housing. Most of Buffalo's housing challenges stem from the fact that we have some of the oldest housing stock in North America. We need to revitalize and rehabilitate that housing stock, but we need to supplement that with new housing. When Buffalo's population started declining, we experienced a housing surplus. Many of you in this room lived through that surplus. What do we do with all our vacant and abandoned buildings? But the overwhelming policy response was to demolish thousands and thousands of homes over the last 20 years, with virtually no new construction to replace them. Boy, would we love to have those thousands and thousands of units back right now. Many of us knew that funding demolitions was not the way to go. It wasn't a holistic plan that we needed, and we knew that one day it would become a problem, and right now that day is here. Now, our population's rebounding. We don't have enough housing to accommodate our growth. Even with the small increase of 10,000 people over the last decade, we've seen the squeeze that that's put on our housing market. And if we continue even this modest growth without increasing our housing supply, we are going to be in big trouble. Part of the problem we have is there's a mismatch between income levels in Buffalo and housing costs. The average three bedroom Buffalo house costs $230,000. But 2/3 of Buffalo households make under $70,000 a year. Let me just let that sink in. 2/3 of Buffalo households make less than $70,000 a year. Even if you're at the top of that range, $70,000, the mortgage on the average house is going to eat up 40% of your take-home pay. Think about that. That means that the vast majority of Buffalo households cannot afford a house in Buffalo. And if the average Buffalonian can't afford to buy a house, building a new house in Buffalo is out of the question. So we know there's very few starter homes being built each year, and it's contributing to our overall housing shortage. The good news is we're sort of all keyed into this as the problem, and housing is going to be a major focus in Albany this year. But most of the housing conversation is still based on New York City's problems. Their challenges are based on a shortage of available land. For decades, maybe over a century, New York's had nowhere else to build but up. And so most of the state's housing problems were created to solve that problem. Let me say it again. Most of the state's housing programs were created to solve that problem. If you have one building site, the state will pay you to put as many units as possible on that site. Makes perfect sense if you're in Brooklyn. But this one-size-fits-all approach based on New York City's needs doesn't work across the entire state. We can take a cue from how we changed our economic development policy in New York State. Not long ago, there was one plan for the whole state. But we realized that didn't make sense, and we split the state up into 10 different economic zones because each part of the state is different. And we need to start thinking of housing in a similar way. We need to develop programs that really reflect the different regional needs throughout the state. So unlike New York City, Buffalo's problem isn't a lack of vacant lots. We have the room. Buffalo has 13,000 vacant residential lots. But the market is not developing on those 13,000 lots. None of this is surprising why the market's not responding. It's why the state and federal government has always been involved in creating new housing. Think FHA mortgages, the GI Bill, tax exemptions. Think of the post-war housing boom. It didn't happen based on market conditions. Most of the housing in America was not built as a natural reaction to market forces. It was built on government incentives. And history shows us that the market won't meet our demand, and we can't wait for it to change. People need housing now. So here's part one, incentivizing construction of affordable homes. There are a couple reasons why housing plans built around the downstate paradigm fall short in Buffalo. There are parts of Buffalo that lend themselves to building up. We know it, downtown, some of the more commercial areas. But that's not what we think about when we think of Buffalo's neighborhoods. Buffalo's densities come from mixes of singles and doubles. Another issue is that most existing plans depend on local tax abatements. Tax abatements might work in New York City because they have the largest tax base of any city in the nation. They have a larger tax base, I think, but 4 states. Their economy is bigger than most countries. But we don't have that luxury in Western New York. We have a decimated tax base that can barely support our current community needs. And when you give tax abatements, you're asking municipalities that are already cash-strapped to provide the incentives, all while the municipality takes on the cost of school, fire, police, and social services. It just doesn't work. So if we want to improve Buffalo's fiscal health, a solution based on city and county tax abatements, it's not productive. So we need a plan to get more houses on the tax roll and incentivize new construction. But we also need to make sure that we're strengthening our neighborhoods without diminishing their character. Keeping these goals in mind, we've devised a pilot project for Buffalo that would create 2,000 homes over a 5-year period. The program would start in Buffalo, but it could be the proof of concept that could be replicated in other upstate similar markets that look just like Buffalo. So it's 3 steps to this. 1, we have to design 1 and 2 family homes that fit our neighborhoods. We need to provide New York State subsidies to get the houses built. And then we need to sell the homes at affordable prices to Buffalonians with low to moderate incomes. With this program, we'd make sure we're matching the aesthetic of the surrounding neighborhood. That means they'll look like Buffalo houses. A house in Fillmore is going to look like a house in Fillmore. A house in Riverside is going to look like a house in Riverside. It also means building a mix of singles and doubles. Doubles are time tested in Buffalo. They work. You got doubles that are a century old and they still work in our market. We also have to make sure that the homes that we build are obtainable to the people who already live in the neighborhoods. So the program will be targeted at current residents. We'll give a priority to people who live in those neighborhoods. And these are people who have long-standing jobs, steady sources of income, but they can't afford to buy a house because of market conditions. Spending money on housing is already a big part of what we do as a state. New York State allocates billions of dollars in taxpayer funding to housing every year. The Department of Homes and Community Renewal is New York State's affordable housing agency. We call it HCR. HCR already has the money to pay for this type of program. But admittedly, they have a difficult task. They have to create housing for parts of the state that are very different from one another. But what we're proposing is a more effective way to use that money in Buffalo. New York State spends about $450,000 for each affordable unit that they build. In some parts of the state, that's money well spent. Here in Buffalo, changing the way we spend this money could produce a much bigger bang for the buck. Instead of creating 20 apartment units in one big building that doesn't fit our neighborhoods, we can take the same money and build 10 new singles and 5 new doubles. We know that a single 100-unit building is a lot less paperwork for HCR than 100 single family homes on separate lots. It's a lot more work and it's a lot different work. It'll mean more work for all parts of HCR, but I think that's a small price to pay for breathing life back into Buffalo's neighborhoods. The program would have a wide range of benefits. First and foremost, it'll help people build generational wealth. Owning a home is the most common way to build wealth in America, and we know it works in Erie County. The average low-income homeowner who owns a house has gained $70,000 in wealth in the last decade. This plan would also help to shrink the persistent and widening racial wealth gap. Buffalo's Black residents have dealt with decades of housing discrimination, policies of redlining, and straight-up point-of-sale discrimination. Interventions like government-backed loans, the GI Bill, they intentionally excluded Black families from building homes. We still see the results of these racist policies and how segregated our community remains today, and it's part of the reason there's a massive racial wealth gap in Buffalo. The stats back it all up. All across America, white households are far more likely to own their homes than Black households, but in Buffalo, it's worse than in other cities. The homeownership rate for Buffalo's white residents is right in line with the national average, but the rate for city's Black residents is 17% below the national average. This program would provide a vehicle for more of Buffalo's Black residents to begin building wealth after generations of exclusion and discrimination. I mentioned earlier that we need a plan that gets houses on the tax roll. We estimated that each house we build would add almost $6,000 to the tax base. $6,000 on a one-off doesn't sound like much, but multiply it by 2,000 homes, and that's $12 million additional dollars coming to the city and the county coffers each year going forward. Imagine what we could do with another $120 million over 10 years. How many more community centers could we open? How many new snowplows and fire trucks could we buy? It would mean more money for senior services, playgrounds, school districts, and maybe we could keep our pools open. Think about it. Think about what it would do for the fiscal health of Buffalo in Erie County. We have thousands of homes on the tax rolls that were built 100 years ago. Building thousands of more homes would solidify Buffalo's financial stability for another century. Of course, it'll also help to revitalize our neighborhoods. Nothing hurts a property value like having a vacant lot next door. Building on vacant lots will increase surrounding property values, and it will create a domino effect of investment. Investing in these neighborhoods will encourage neighbors to make improvements to their own homes. This program would also help solve a problem that has led to higher rents in Buffalo for years. When there's a shortage of starter homes being built, it creates a clog in the rental market. Renters who can't afford to buy a house continue renting because they have nowhere else to go. Combined with a lack of new rental inventory, it leads to a shortage of vacant apartments. On to part two. Building new homes will have a positive impact on the tight rental market, but that alone won't solve the problem. What we need is a plan designed to put more rental properties on the market. Buffalo's always had a housing quality problem. Today, many of Buffalo's affordable housing apartments are in varying states of disrepair. A lot of them haven't had upgrades in decades. And unfortunately, there's another group of apartments that are borderline unlivable. Rats, roaches, broken water lines, broken sewer lines. Because of Buffalo's old and poorly maintained housing stock, lead poisoning is rampant across our city. Whether it's collapsing ceilings, lead, mold, nobody should have to live in these dangerous conditions. It used to be that a tenant could up and leave their apartment to find something else in their price range. But today, a tight market forces families to choose between unlivable conditions and homelessness. The dilemma is evident every day in housing court. The judge can strictly enforce the building codes, which results in the apartment being condemned and the family being put on the street, or they could keep the family living in substandard housing because at least they'll have a roof over their heads. We need to get out of this paradigm of making judges and families choose between terrible options. So you wonder, how do we get here? One cause for sure is out-of-town landlords who have no intention of ever maintaining an apartment. But Buffalo also has a high number of smaller, undercapitalized landlords compared to other cities. Many of these people cannot afford to make repairs on their own. Stuff like putting on a new roof and a new furnace. So what happens is that a lot of rental units come offline. I meet seniors all the time who tell me that they can't put their upstairs unit on the market because their furnace broke a decade ago. There are thousands of empty units all around the city of Buffalo. Our friends at Belmont Housing Resources have told us that their clients who have Section 8 certificates can't find an apartment that'll pass the housing quality inspection. People are losing their benefits because there aren't enough safe and affordable housing. But we know that there are mom and pop landlords that want to participate, but they can't afford to get their apartments up to the standard. We've come up with a plan that would solve some of these problems and put 1,500 high-quality, affordable rented units online in Buffalo over a 5-year period. It's a plan that will help renters and mom and pop landlords at the same time. I'm proposing a grant that landlords could apply for to fund improvements in their rental property. They could apply for up to $75,000 per unit. In exchange for the grant, the landlord would be required to rent their property at an affordable price for a set number of years. The program would be open to an additional 2,500 small landlords in Rochester, Syracuse, and Albany based on each city's population. And when distributing these grants, we'll prioritize vacant units that are in need of major repairs. It is way faster to do a rehab than it is to build a new unit. This way, we can quickly get more affordable housing units onto the market. If we want more safe and affordable units in Buffalo, this is low-hanging fruit. Maintaining old units is more cost-effective than building new ones. It's also better for the environment. It improves the quality of rentals in Buffalo, creates more affordable options, and it softens the overall demand on the rental market. It will also maintain our local ownership of rental properties. Right now, we have a vast majority of Buffalo apartments are owned by local people. We want to keep it that way. This plan would provide those landlords with steady incomes without decreasing their property values. The obvious benefit is that this keeps the money circulating in our economy, but there's another benefit. When a landlord is actually part of the community, they're more invested in it. It's no surprise that we see way more housing code violations for landlords that don't live in Buffalo and in Erie County. Rounding on to part 3. We've already spoke of how Buffalo has the old housing stock. Erie County has a disproportionate number of houses built from early to the mid 20th century. What that means is almost no Buffalo houses are insulated to the modern standard. A leaky building envelope means higher utility bills that makes home ownership costly. It's also a big problem for renters. Renters in Buffalo pay their own heat bills. We all know somebody who's dealt with the dilemma. You have to rob Peter to pay Paul to keep current every month. Do you pay your rent or do you pay your utility bill? Are you more worried about getting evicted or are you more worried about keeping your heat on? And we saw that during last year's storms, poorly insulated houses can become deadly during extreme weather condition. If the power goes out, they get dangerously cold really fast. A home insulated to the modern standard can stay above freezing for much longer, and it can literally save lives. Insulating an old house is an easy way for households to reduce their long-term costs, partially due to lower utility bill, but it also prevents issues that we all know about. Frozen pipes, ice dams that water comes to the house, ruins the plaster, and the problems go on and on from there. New York State has a lot of programs right now to help homeowners reduce the cost of insulating their homes, but they're all underutilized. There's a few common reasons most people don't take advantage of these programs. They're complicated. Most homeowners lack the financial means to pay the upfront cost. In the existing programs, they have really complicated application processes, and you have to demonstrate your eligibility, and it can be really time consuming. There's also an anxiety about these programs because you put the money out, and only if you followed all the steps do you get the money back. Who can afford to take that risk? People worry, did I fill out the paperwork properly? Am I going to get the money back? And because of that, most people opt not to participate in this program. And unfortunately, there's not much incentives for landlords to be involved in these programs because they pass that cost on to their tenants. So we need to stop relying on homeowners to apply for the incentive programs for insulation upgrades because that happens at a slow trickle. What we have realized is that creating a more effective incentive program will allow us to reach many more people every year. It will allow us to reduce utility costs for thousands of New Yorkers. We can scale statewide insulation efforts by having energy companies upgrade your insulation the same way as they would come and upgrade your meter. With an amendment to the Public Service Law, we can task utility companies with leading large-scale insulation efforts. I'm proposing a statewide program that would have these companies proactively approach customers and offer to upgrade their house's building envelope. Doing this will allow the cost to be amortized over several decades and spread over the whole rate base. The cost per customer would be vanishingly small. It's the same way it works when a utility company performs maintenance or rebuilds electric transmission lines. When you see a company digging up a street for utility maintenance, customers are paying that through their rate. We don't notice a change in our electric bill. It would be the same with the insulation programs. And while developing this plan, I spoke with National Fuel and National Grid to help determine what's feasible for them. They already have a highly trained workforce. They're a unionized workforce, and they have unionized contractors willing to do this work. The utilities estimate that they could reach 20,000 homes in their service area in 10 years. They also helped us get an idea of the potential cost. They have estimated that to reach 20,000 homes, it would increase the year bill by about $2 per month. Meanwhile, the program would put more money into people's pockets, save participating customers an estimated $16 million over a 10-year period in the Buffalo area alone. Of course, there's another big benefit to insulating thousands of homes. Insulating homes can have an incredible impact on carbon emission reduction. but only if we do it at scale. Helping people insulate their homes will also make switching to alternative heat sources more realistic for low and middle income New Yorkers. If the state's goal is to eventually transition more people to heat pumps and geothermal system, this is where we should be starting. Part 4, increasing access to eviction prevention funds. We've already talked a little bit about eviction, but the final part of this vision addresses it head on. Going back to Matthew Desmond books, he wrote, "It takes a good amount of money and time to establish a home. Eviction can erase all that in a second." Many people who rent in Buffalo are one stroke of bad luck away from losing everything they have. Losing a job or dealing with an unexpected illness can put a lot of families in a position where they can't afford their rent. It takes years for a family to acquire everything that makes a house a home, but one bad month can steal it all away. We've all seen it in the city on Big Garbage Day. Entire households are put out to the curb. Eviction is massively destabilizing. Losing your home impacts everything in your life. Leads to increased truancy for students, worse mental and physical health, lost jobs, loss of access to childcare. The list goes on and on and on. Even once a family begins to recover, having an eviction in their past makes it harder to find the next apartment. And the people who get evicted aren't the only ones who lose out. Eviction impact the stability of the entire neighborhood. Buffalo has always struggled with eviction rates. The housing shortage has only made the problem worse. With few alternatives for evicted renters to transition to, the burden ends up falling to Erie County in the already overwhelmed shelter system. We should be obviously doing everything we can to keep people housed, but there's a big financial component to this as well. 90% of the people evicted in Buffalo are evicted because they owe back rent. But here's the really shocking part. The average amount that they're getting evicted over, $1,200. $1,200, that's it. It's hard to believe that someone's life can be upended over such a small amount of money. It's even harder to believe when you learn that the taxpayers spend about $13,000 for each household that ends up in a shelter system. So there's a million good reasons to do whatever we can to keep people from getting evicted, but the math alone makes it a smart financial policy. Luckily, we have programs and resources in place to stop evictions. We have two programs, the Emergency Assistance for Adults and the Emergency Assistance for Families. They both provide short-term emergency financial assistance to keep renters in their homes during a difficult period. We call them one-shots. But New York State has created unnecessary burdens to connecting people to these funds. But there's ways we can fix that problem. We can increase the income cap to make more people eligible. We can remove restrictions on how often people can receive this assistance, and we can stop requiring people to prove that they can afford their rent going forward. These restrictions, they're all relics of welfare reform from the 1980s and the 1990s. We haven't upgraded them significantly in decades. They don't reflect our modern understanding of the benefits of eviction prevention, and they don't fit the way we administer other programs. New Yorkers can qualify for HEAP, heating assistance, every year because we know it keeps people alive. We don't ask them to show that they can afford to pay their heating bills in the future. So why would we treat emergency rental assistance any differently? An update in these guidelines is long overdue. So I'm introducing new legislation that would remove these overly burdensome state restrictions. I'm also supporting Senator Kavanaugh's legislation to remove the requirement that people repay these emergency funds. Together, these reforms will unlock funds that are already allocated to Erie County, and it would keep thousands of people housed each year. So our main goal with these plans is to provide stability to people living in Buffalo. But doing that will have a ripple effect on the region as a whole. Buffalo's lack of high quality, affordable housing, it's stifling our economic growth, and it's stifling our ability for future growth. To grow economically, we need more people. And in order to have more people, we need more housing. All of this work will support good paying jobs. The plan I've laid out will abide by high road economic development principles, will have wage standards that guarantee that everybody doing this work is being paid enough so they can afford to live in our community, will prioritize local hires and utilize organized labor. So by addressing Buffalo's housing shortage, we'll be able to strengthen the economy of the entire region. This vision, it's a good start, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make it a reality. There's momentum for these kind of changes right now, but we need to work with community advocates and policymakers to get everybody on the same page. It's an ambitious job. I'm confident that we're up for the challenge. It's important that we have allies like Senator Kavanaugh, and we have a governor from Buffalo who understands the challenges that we face, and the governor wants to do something about them. So in the coming weeks, I'll be meeting with other leaders at the state, local, and county levels to help move this plan forward. But I cannot do this alone. To make it happen, we're going to need the help and the support of the community and everyone in this room. And I want you to be involved. We have a comment sheet and a QR code for you to scan to share any thoughts you have about the policies that I outlined today, any suggestions you had. And I'm looking forward to getting the feedback and the comments and integrating them as we move forward. But before we wrap up today, I just want to say it means so much to me that so many people are so interested in helping to solve this problem. If we all work together, I'm confident that we're going to be able to make a real difference in our city. It's going to lead to better living conditions, a much healthier long-term financial situation for the city, and most importantly, stability for families. Right now, we're proud to be called the city of good neighbors, but when we accomplish these goals, we're going to be worthy of a new title. When we're done, Buffalo is going to be the city of good neighborhoods. Thank you.